Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me back. I'm glad to be a two-time Critical Themes presenter. So my research, moving on from my PhD in communications, has moved into the areas of social computing and community technology, and specifically in the areas of urban informatics, which is a relatively new formulation that includes social science, computer science, urban planning, and issues at the intersection of technology and cities, which is a course that I taught in the Media Studies Department a couple of years ago. And I'm also really interested in open innovation systems, so applying some of the online innovation platforms like Wikipedia and thinking about how that might be applied in offline setting as well. And more recently, I've gotten involved in some areas, including mobile health, sustainability, and food ecosystems through my work at Cornell. And just to frame this a little bit, I think that the last decade of discussion about the internet has primarily discussed collaboration across vast distances and distributed collaboration. And I'm really interested in how we can think about supporting users of technology and reformat cities and public spaces and the architectures and technologies within them to support and enable local knowledge sharing and collaboration and innovation in place. So I'll just give you a little bit of a recap from my last presentation from the dissertation project. And when I first started this project, I distinctly remember being in an elevator in Budapest with a senior faculty member in my field, and when he heard that I wanted to study the wireless internet, he said, "You can't study something that doesn't exist." And that was in 2002, which was actually 3 months after one of the first free public wireless networks was built in Bryant Park by a community wireless organization called NYC Wireless. So I think in a way, at that time, this was a phenomenon that not a lot of people were interested in or following, and that one way of actually studying things that are not widely understood is through self-observation and experimentation, testing new combinations of technologies, and following the social practices of the users of technology and the early adopters that you're interested in, and that's what I did in this project. So some of the main themes that emerged in this project were the social construction of technology, the role of place, the role of emergent forms of organizing, and community. And so some of the assumptions, I think, in the literature about virtual organizations is that they lack the kinds of water cooler conversations that happen in face-to-face offices, and that there's a sense of technology being ubiquitous, and the phrase anytime, anywhere is constantly used in both advertising about mobile and wireless technologies and essentially means broadband availability of information. So that phrase is often used. And I think, well, I'll tell a story that I hope will help you better understand the ways in which users of technology are experiencing the role of place. So that's going to be the central theme that I'll be talking about today. So some of the concepts that you might be familiar with from media studies literature, Innes's work on space bias and time biased media and technology, James Carey's work on ritual versus transmission views of communication, Oldenburg's work on third places, Manuel Castell's work on the space of flows and the space of places, and then one that you might not be as familiar with, Moultrie's work on innovation spaces, which are essentially the idea that companies are very interested in finding new ways to reformat the architectures within their offices to support better interactions between employees. So I'll tell a couple of stories from the field work just to kind of, again, recap my earlier presentation before I start talking about the current project that I'm working on. So in doing qualitative interviews with users of Wi-Fi technologies, I came across a really interesting person that just his work habits really fascinated me. And this is Victor. Victor's a graphic illustrator. He commutes 40 minutes from East New York in Brooklyn to one of 3 different Starbucks. And he says, I have a pre-production space, a production space, and a deadline space. And all of them were Starbucks coffee shops, but they were different ones in different neighborhoods chosen for specific reasons. The pre-production space was actually located within a Barnes & Noble store, and this is where he did all of his book research for his web project. So he would systematically go around choosing books from the shelf, and if he needed to design a website about medieval Europe, he would get a book about medieval Europe and start sketching out plans, and he'd worked on movies and websites and things like that. And at a certain point in his work process, he actually had to move to another Starbucks that had more power outlets, more of a social network, embedded social network, which, he had friends that would constantly come to visit him, check in on him. He would get discounts on coffee. It was nearby his favorite restaurants, and that was his production space. And then when he really needed to get work done, he would actually move to a Starbucks in Koreatown where he said no one would ever talk to him, and that's where he would focus on the work. So his work pattern just really fascinated me, and I thought it was very interesting the way he was distributing his work across a wide variety of spaces, and each one was meaningful in its own way for different reasons. And this is just part of the socio-technical relationship between the fact that these Starbucks coffee shops with Wi-Fi enabled him to create these kind of workspaces. And another story I'll tell about him is that when I asked him, Victor, why are you working here at a Starbucks? And he said, well, I'm designing for them, right? And he looked around at the customers and the passersby and New Yorkers and really believed that his role was to kind of put himself in the field, much in the way that, say, an ethnographic researcher such as myself would put myself in the field to be more in touch with the potential audience that he was designing for. And so he was using the cafe as a forum for constant feedback and testing of his ideas on potential audiences. So he would have people coming by and saying, hey, I really like that design, or why don't you do this? And in fact, he'd even gotten his very first job as a designer at 3 in the morning working at a pizza shop, because his work was very visual, his sketchbooks, and so he had sort of, throughout his career, public spaces were really meaningful and important to him as a site for his work. So how did these stories help me think about the role of place? Well, I was able to understand that Wi-Fi is both a space-biased and a time-biased media, that it brings people together in physical spaces, as well as allowing them to reach out across vast distances. And while I think the vast majority of disciplines study communication from the perspective of the transmission of content across distances, what I was really doing is looking at Wi-Fi enabled public spaces as the rituals that make up our culture, and really studying it as a set of cultural practices. And you could certainly argue that the availability of Wi-Fi in both, that it degrades the nature of democratic discussion in third places like cafes, but there's also possibility that it can enhance democratic discussion if that's something that you're interested in. So I wouldn't say that it's fundamentally about isolating people or disengaging, but that there are these interesting ad hoc communities that are coming together in these spaces. Castell sets up kind of a false dichotomy between the space of flows and the space of places, and I think that my work really reinforces the idea that these communities are coming together in an ad hoc way, and the fact that these places are so meaningful to them and that they really form friendships and attachments to the people, that really reinforces the space of place. And so finally, thinking about the way in which Wi-Fi enabled public spaces are can potentially be seen as innovation spaces, and that we might design for that and support users by adding a layer of digital applications and services. So to sum up that project, I came up with the reframing of codescapes and trying to really think about language that would help us merge the socio-technical with also the spatial aspect of these emergent forms of organizing.